Welcome to another deep dive. Today, we're going to be looking at media studies. We've got a fascinating research article here about how the Portuguese press covered the Madeleine McCann case, and it compares two newspapers' approaches.
Yeah, this is a case that really, captivated the world, didn't it?
Absolutely. So for anyone who needs a quick refresher, Madeleine McCann was a 3-year-old British girl who vanished from her family's holiday apartment back in 2007 in Portugal.
Right.
And this case sparked a media frenzy internationally, tons of speculation, and it's just, well, it's heartbreaking. But today, we're not really revisiting the case itself. We're going to be focusing on how two very different newspapers, the Público and the Correio da Manhã, shaped the story, how they covered it, and how that may have even shaped public perception.
You've got it. And the research paper really digs into that. Did these newspapers impact not just how people saw the case, but even how they viewed the Portuguese justice system?
That's a good question. And the research article really highlights how Público, which is considered more of a quality paper, known for in-depth reporting, they often took a step back and analyzed the media frenzy surrounding the case. They were questioning the role of sensationalism, and really kind of diving into why the public was so captivated by this story, almost like they were holding up a mirror.
Yeah, I see that. And it's interesting how Correio da Manhã, which is a more popular tabloid, they went in a completely opposite direction. It was like they were almost relishing the drama.
Right.
Daily updates, sections like Film of the Day,
Yeah.
Constantly keeping people hooked. It was almost like a soap opera.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah, they were feeding that fascination, weren't they?
Yeah.
So you have Público encouraging reflection and Correio da Manhã just diving headfirst into that sensationalism is wild.
Yeah. And one of the key areas, of course, is how these two papers with these totally different approaches, how did they portray the McCanns?
Madeline's
Parents, right. So initially, both of them kind of fell into those, typical gender stereotypes, Jerry the father, strong, rational, Kate the mother, more emotional, fragile.
Those classic media tropes.
Right. But then, as suspicion started to fall on the McCanns, you see this real shift. Público stayed pretty cautious, sticking to the facts, focusing on the unanswered questions. Even their wording was really careful.
I'm curious, how did Correio da Manhã handle that? Because, their style is so different.
Well, they went all in on that guilt narrative.
Okay.
They zeroed in on Kate McCann's demeanor, calling her cold, using really suggestive language.
Wow.
Even bringing in those, psychological theories about female criminality.
Oh, wow. So, Público is walking on eggshells. Correio da Manhã is basically writing the verdict. That's intense.
Yeah, it really is. And this is where that concept of trial by media comes in, which the article talks a lot about. Basically, the idea that media coverage, especially when it's full of speculation and unnamed sources, can actually create this bias against someone.
Okay, that makes sense. So could you break down trial by media for our listeners who might not be familiar with that term?
Sure. It's like the media, especially when they use a lot of speculation like Correio da Manhã did, they're kind of acting as judge and jury before there's even been a real trial.
Right.
It creates this prejudgment that can be really hard to overcome, even if someone is later found innocent.
That's a lot of responsibility for the media, right?
It really is. And it highlights how important it is for us, as readers, viewers, to be critical. We got to think about who's telling the story, why, and what might be missing.
So we've talked about how these newspapers, one being very careful and the other, Correio da Manhã, being more sensational, how they portrayed the McCanns. But there's another big part of this case, the forensic evidence.
Absolutely.
And the research article digs into that too, and it's pretty fascinating.
Yeah, both papers covered it, obviously, but their approaches, you guessed it, completely different. Público really took time to explain the whole DNA analysis thing, right?
Yeah.
Acknowledged that it's not always straightforward, talked about probability, trying to make it understandable for everyone.
So they were kind of demystifying the science, not just throwing around jargon.
Exactly. Trying to help readers understand what the evidence meant, not just blindly accept it. Correio da Manhã, total opposite. They went full CSI effect.
Oh, wow. So like the TV show.
Yeah. Big dramatic headlines, oversimplifying the findings, comparing it all to the show. It was entertainment over accuracy.
So they were using pop culture to keep people hooked.
Exactly. And the research paper really emphasizes this, that they might have actually given people a wrong idea about how forensic science really works.
That's pretty concerning, isn't it?
It is, yeah.
So we've got these two newspapers, Público analyzing everything carefully, Correio da Manhã going for the drama.
Right.
And both of them, even with those differences, initially kind of using those gender stereotypes when they talked about the McCanns,
Yep.
which just goes to show that even when news tries to be objective, it can still be affected by unconscious bias.
Absolutely. It
Yeah.
shows just how powerful those unconscious biases can be.
It's fascinating. This whole case with the media frenzy, the way the McCanns were portrayed, the trial by media idea, and then those differences in how they covered the evidence, it all shows us how narratives get shaped and how different ways of telling the story can really impact our understanding of what happened.
Yeah, for sure.
And we're just getting started.
It makes you wonder how much those initial portrayals, even if they seemed subtle at the time, affected how people saw the McCanns as things developed, right?
Yeah, it's almost like setting the stage, isn't it?
Uh-huh.
Like if someone is already labeled as emotional, then any show of emotion gets seen through that lens.
Exactly. And the research paper really digs into that, how those early portrayals might have colored how the public reacted when suspicion started falling on the McCanns.
Okay, so we've talked about the media frenzy, the different ways the McCanns were shown, that trial by media thing, and how the papers handled the forensic evidence. Seems like this case really shows how complicated things get between the media and the justice system, right?
Oh, absolutely. And the article suggests that this whole thing, especially the way Correo de Manhan covered it, it might have actually reinforced some existing worries
Mm-hmm.
about the Portuguese justice system. That it's slow, maybe not that efficient, and could be influenced by outside pressure.
Hmm, that's interesting. Do you think all that attention, especially when the media jumps to conclusions, could actually put pressure on the investigators? Like, could it make things harder for them?
It's definitely possible. Imagine being an investigator on a case that's all over the news. Everybody's got a theory. You're going to feel that pressure, right?
You would.
It could lead to rushing things, maybe even mistakes.
So maybe sometimes less media attention could actually help the investigation.
It's an interesting thought, isn't it? That balance between keeping the public informed and letting the investigators do their job properly, it's tricky.
One thing that really stood out to me in the article was how they talked about the McCann's own approach to the media.
Right.
It wasn't just the newspapers controlling the story. The McCanns had their own strategy.
Absolutely. They hired PR people. They were crafting their own narrative, pushing back against the accusations, trying to manage the information. The researchers even called it a media machine.
Wow, a media machine. So it wasn't just one-sided. They were using the media too, trying to get their message out there.
Exactly. You've got the newspapers, the investigators, and then the McCanns, all with their own goals, trying to control the story. It's like a three-way dance.
It's amazing how many layers this all has. It's not just about what happened, but also about how everyone involved tried to shape the story around it.
That's a really good point. It's like behind any big news story, there's this whole network of different motives and strategies.
Absolutely. Let's go back to the newspapers for a second. The research article pointed out how Publico often took this, meta approach.
Yeah.
They weren't just reporting the case, they were analyzing how the media itself was shaping the story. It was like they were trying to make their readers think about how stories get told and how that influences what we believe.
That's a really interesting approach. By looking at the media frenzy itself, they were encouraging people to be more skeptical, to not just accept everything they read.
That's so important, especially these days when we're bombarded with information from all sides.
Absolutely. And it's even more important when we're talking about sensitive topics like crime and justice. You can't just absorb information passively. You got to be active, question things, look for different perspectives.
So by looking at how these two newspapers cover the same case, we're not just learning about Madeleine McCann, we're learning how to be smarter about the news we consume in general.
Exactly.
Huh.
That's the takeaway. Those skills apply to any news story, not just this one.
It's interesting how Publicos seem to be almost self-aware, reflecting on their own role and how that could influence people's understanding.
It's kind of unique, right?
Yeah, it is. It feels like a commitment to doing journalism well, recognizing the power they have as a newspaper.
I agree.
But then you have Correo de Manhan, and they seem much more focused on the sensational stuff, the drama,
Yeah.
playing into what people want to read, that excitement.
Yeah, and that makes sense for a tabloid, right?
Yeah.
They have a different audience, maybe one that's more drawn to the emotional side of things than the legal details and stuff.
It's like they're fulfilling different needs. Publico wants you to think deeply. Correo de Manhan wants to grab your attention.
Exactly. And neither approach is inherently good or bad. They're just different ways of telling the story.
But it does make you think about the ethics of it all,
Yeah.
especially with a case like this that's so sensitive.
Right, right. Like, should a newspaper always focus on being accurate and objective, even if it means losing some of the drama and maybe some readers?
That's a tough question.
It is. And it's something journalists and news outlets are constantly wrestling with.
We've talked a lot about how they covered the case, but what about the impact? Did the researchers have any thoughts on how this coverage might have affected people's opinions, not just about the case itself, but maybe about the Portuguese justice system, or even how we think about missing children in general?
That's a really important question, and it's why studying the media matters. The researchers suggested that reading Publico versus Correio de Mohan could actually lead to different understandings of the case and even of the justice system. They thought that Correio de Mohan, with all the unnamed sources and speculation, might have made people think the Portuguese justice system was easily manipulated, like not as trustworthy.
So even though they were trying to inform people, they might have accidentally made people less trusting of the system that was supposed to find Madeline.
That's a possibility they brought up, and it's really thought-provoking.
It really shows how important it is to think critically about the news, to question the narratives, look at the sources.
Couldn't agree more. We're not just passive receivers of information, we have to engage with it, think for ourselves, and form our own informed opinions.
The article talked about how the Madeleine McCann case became this worldwide phenomenon, a signal crime, they called it. What do you think they meant by that?
It's an interesting idea, right? The idea that certain crimes, because they get so much attention, they become these cultural moments, they shape how we understand similar cases that happen later.
Like they set a precedent for how we view these kinds of events.
Yeah, exactly. And I think the researchers were suggesting that the way this case was covered, especially by the more sensational outlets, could have a long-lasting impact on how missing children cases are seen and reported on in the future.
That's a sobering thought.
It is. And it highlights how much responsibility the media has when they cover these kinds of stories. The way they frame things can have a big impact, not just on public opinion, but maybe even on how investigations and legal processes are conducted.
Wow, so we're not just learning about the Madeleine McCann case, but about how to be more aware of how the media works and how to be more critical of what we read and see.
Exactly. In a world where we're constantly being bombarded with information, media literacy is essential.
The article pointed out something interesting. Even with all the media attention, the McCanns weren't just sitting back and taking it. They hired PR experts. They crafted their own narrative.
Yes. They weren't just reacting to what the media was saying. They were actively trying to shape the story, pushing back against the accusations, and using the media to keep the focus on finding their daughter.
So they were fighting back, trying to control their own story.
Exactly. It's a good reminder that even when it feels like the media is in control, individuals and families can still fight back. They can challenge unfair portrayals, and they can use the media to advocate for themselves.
That's empowering. It's easy to feel overwhelmed by the media, especially in high-profile cases like this, but this shows that we can be active participants, not just passive consumers of information.
Absolutely. We can be informed, we can be critical, and we can use our voices to make sure the stories being told are fair, accurate, and reflect the complexities of real life.
One thing that really stood out about Publico was how they seemed to be engaging in self-critique, questioning their own role in the story and acknowledging their own potential biases.
It's really unusual to see that, isn't it?
It is like they were holding a mirror up to themselves, reflecting on how their work could influence people.
It's a refreshing level of self-awareness and something we could all learn from, not just journalists. We all have biases, we all have agendas, and it's important to recognize how those things might be shaping our views.
It's a call for more honesty and transparency, acknowledging that even when we try to be objective, we're still human, we're still influenced by things.
Exactly. We need to be more aware of the filters we're looking through, both our own internal filters and the ones created by the media, social structures, and our culture.
Okay, so we've explored how these two newspapers, Publico and Correio de Monja, with their very different approaches, covered the same case. We've talked about the McCann's media strategy, the idea of trial by media, and how all of this might have impacted how people saw the case and even the justice system. It's clear this case was about so much more than just a missing child. It was a media phenomenon that touched on a whole range of social, cultural, and ethical issues.
That's a great way to sum it up. The researchers did a really impressive job of breaking down those issues, showing how they played out in the Portuguese press, and offering insights into the power of media narratives and the need for us all to be more critical of the media we consume.
This deep dive has been incredibly thought-provoking. We've seen how different news outlets can frame the same story in very different ways, how those choices can affect what people believe, and how even when journalists try to be objective, they can still be influenced by biases and outside pressures.
It's a good reminder that we all need to be more thoughtful about how we engage with news and information.
Absolutely. We need to question the narratives we're presented with, seek out different viewpoints, and be aware of our own biases. It's about being active participants in the information landscape, not just passive consumers.
It really does make you think, doesn't it? It wasn't just a case, it was a media event, right?
Totally. It's about what happened to Madeleine, of course, but it's also about how that story got told, who was controlling the narrative, and how that narrative ended up affecting not just the people involved, but even big institutions like the justice system.
Yeah, it's fascinating. And I think this deep dive has given us a lot to consider, not just about this case, but about how we approach news and information in general.
Okay, so we've covered a ton of ground already. The two newspapers, Publico and Correo de Manhart, their different styles, how they covered the same story, how that might have affected what people believed, the impact on the McCanns, the police, the whole justice system. But before we wrap up, did the researchers give any specific examples from the actual newspaper articles that really illustrate these points?
Oh, yeah, they did. Like, remember how we talked about the forensic evidence?
Uh-huh.
They compared how each paper handled that. Publico, they were all about accuracy, being nuanced. They gave these really detailed explanations of DNA analysis. They even explained things like probability so regular people could understand.
So they were trying to give their readers the tools to understand the evidence, not just giving them a simplified version.
Exactly. They emphasized that DNA evidence isn't always clear-cut. It can be complicated. There are different ways to interpret it. They wanted their readers to grasp that. Then you have Correo de Manhã, and they went full-on CSI effect.
Oh, yeah, like we were talking about before.
Yep. Big, attention-grabbing headlines, simplifying the findings, even making direct links to the TV show. It was more about being entertaining than being completely accurate.
It sounds like they were using pop culture to keep people interested, maybe even if it meant sacrificing some accuracy or a deeper understanding of the limits of DNA evidence.
Exactly. The researchers pointed that out, that Correo de Manhan, it might have been more fun to read for some people, but it could also have given them a distorted view of how forensic science actually works in real life.
Like those funhouse mirrors, they're fun to look at, but they don't show you what you really look like.
That's a great way to put it.
It just shows how careful we have to be about how information is presented to us, especially when it's something complex like forensic science.
For sure. We can't just accept everything we read or see. We have to think about the source, how they're presenting the information, and if there might be other viewpoints that aren't being shown.
Another big difference the researchers pointed out was in how the two newspapers portrayed the McCanns, especially Kate McCann.
Yeah, and this really shows how gender stereotypes can creep into news reporting, even when they're trying to be objective. Like, at first, both papers kind of use those traditional roles. Jerry, the strong, rational dad. Kate, the emotional, fragile mom.
Those stereotypes are everywhere. It's no wonder they show up even in news stories.
Right. But then, when the McCanns started becoming suspects, the coverage changed in a really interesting way. Publico, remember, they were always super cautious.
Yeah.
They stuck to focusing on what wasn't known, didn't say anything for sure about guilt or innocence.
So they were basically giving the McCanns the benefit of the doubt, not jumping to conclusions until the investigation was done.
That's how the researchers saw it. But Correo de Manhã went in a different direction. They really focused on how Kate seemed cold, using words that made her sound guilty, and even brought in those psychological ideas about women and crime that we talked about before.
It's crazy how different they are. Publico is holding back. Correo de Manhã is practically saying she's guilty. Makes you wonder how those different ways of writing about her, plus those gender stereotypes, made readers think about her.
It's really powerful, the impact of language and how we frame things. The words we use, the way we present information, even little things like how we phrase stuff, it can all make a huge difference in how people understand things and what opinions they form.
This case really shows how those choices, whether we're aware of them or not, can change the story and even potentially affect how justice is carried out.
Definitely. It highlights how important media literacy is, being aware of those subtle cues and how they can influence us. We have to be critical thinkers, always asking ourselves, why are they presenting it this way? What's missing? What are the other sides of the story?
The research paper also mentioned that the Portuguese press, especially Correio de Manhan, used a lot of leaks and unnamed sources. That plays into that trial by media problem we were talking about earlier, right?
Yeah, that's a huge issue. When news sources use unnamed sources, it's impossible for us to know if the information is even true. Who are these sources? Why are they saying this? Can we trust them? Without that context, it's easy to get caught up in speculation, and that's when trial by media really takes off.
So, before the legal system even gets a chance, public opinion is already deciding guilt or innocence based on information that might be completely wrong.
Exactly. And that can do real damage. It can influence potential jurors, make it harder for someone to get a fair trial.
In this case, it seems like Correo de Manhan's coverage, with all its focus on speculation and rumors, created this atmosphere of suspicion around the McCanns that might have affected how the public and even law enforcement saw them.
Yeah, it's a valid concern. And it shows how important responsible journalism is, especially with sensitive cases. The media has to report the facts accurately and fairly, avoid sensationalizing things, and remember that everyone is innocent until proven guilty in a court of law.
This deep dive has been about so much more than just understanding the Madeleine McCann case, hasn't it? It's about understanding how the media works, how it can shape our perceptions, how it can influence the justice system, and even how it can affect our own personal beliefs and attitudes.
You nailed it. It's about being more aware of the power the media has, both the good and the bad.
The researcher said something interesting about how the Madeleine McCann case turned into this worldwide media spectacle. News outlets everywhere were covering it. Do you think all that global attention affected how it was covered and how people saw it?
Oh, for sure. The pressure on investigators must have been enormous with the whole world watching, and the media frenzy was just insane. It was like the case became this global product, you
Yeah.
know.
Hey,
News outlets were competing for the most shocking headlines, the most exclusive information. And that kind of pressure can lead to sloppy reporting, focusing on drama over accuracy, and sometimes even mixing facts with speculation.
it's like the case became this symbol, something bigger than itself, tapping into those fears we all have about our kids' safety, about families being vulnerable, about evil hiding in places we think are safe.
Yeah, I think you're right. It shows how the media can shape not just how we understand specific events, but also our whole view of the world, how safe we feel, and how we see danger and risk.
It reminds us that we can't just passively take in what the media tells us. We have to think critically, not just about the specific facts, but about the bigger stories they're creating and how those stories might affect our own beliefs, attitudes, and even how we act.
Totally. We have to be aware of how the media, on purpose or not, shapes how we see the world. And we need to learn how to think critically so we can navigate all that information and come to our own conclusions.
So the Madeleine McCann case, even with all the unanswered questions and the media frenzy, it gives us a really good example of how to be more media literate. It helps us understand how stories get told, how hard it is to find the truth, and how important it is to be informed and engaged citizens.
It's a reminder